Ever wondered what happens when the law turns against its own? Some power hides behind uniforms, others behind silence. On a quiet Georgia road, two officers pulled over a lone black woman, expecting obedience. She looked ordinary, calm voice, no badge in sight. But Alana Brooks wasn't just another driver. They planted drugs in her trunk, laughed as they cuffed her, and dragged her into the station on false charges. To them, it was just another setup. But within hours, their smirks would vanish. Because Alana was the director of the DEA, and by arresting her, they didn't just make a mistake. They cracked open the system that had protected them for years. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss, only on Dark Threads. Could this be the tip of a much darker conspiracy? The morning air was heavy with the kind of stillness that made everything feel paused between breaths. A soft mist hovered just above the road, casting a gentle veil over the forest-lined highway as Alana Brooks guided her silver sedan through the curves of the Georgia back roads. Her window cracked just enough to invite the scent of damp pine and fresh asphalt into the cabin. It had rained the night before, and the pavement still wore the sheen of it, glistening in the overcast light that bled through the clouds like a sky reluctant to fully wake. She wasn't dressed for attention, gray zip-up, navy jeans, hair pulled into a low bun, no badge, no motorcade. Her phone was silenced in the cup holder beside her coffee, untouched since she'd pulled out of her sister's driveway earlier that morning. The trip had been long overdue, 3 days away from Washington, surrounded by warm family noise, homework at the kitchen table, and late-night laughter with her niece over card games and peach cobbler that didn't come from a city bakery, but a real oven in a real home. For a while, the title she carried back in D.C. hadn't mattered, and that was the point. Here, she wasn't a public figure or a federal name on a letterhead, just Aunt Alana, thoughtful and present, folding laundry and dancing to old music in socks that slid too easily across hardwood floors. As the road stretched out before her, empty and unhurried, she glanced down at her dashboard. No missed calls, no urgent notifications, just the slow rhythm of a weekend ending. Her fingers tapped gently against the steering wheel in time with the low hum of soul music drifting from the stereo. A Marvin Gaye track playing soft enough not to distract, but steady enough to anchor the mood. That was when she saw it. The subtle glint of a cruiser's grille in her rearview mirror, too close and too quiet to be casual. At first, she assumed it would pass, another patrol car making rounds in a quiet county with little else to do on a Monday morning. But it didn't. It held its position, matching her pace, its presence deliberate and patient like someone watching through a one-way glass. She slowed slightly, checking her speed, 43 in a 45. No sudden movements. No swerving. She signaled toward the right shoulder to let them pass, but they remained in her lane. When the lights finally came, they flickered without urgency. No siren, no rush in their flash, just a quiet assertion of power. Blue and red dancing in her mirrors with an unspoken message. Pull over now. She eased the sedan onto the gravel shoulder, her signal still blinking dutifully as the engine quieted. With practiced calm, she placed both hands on the wheel, her posture straight, her eyes forward. This wasn't her first traffic stop, not by any stretch, and certainly not her first encounter with the kind of authority that liked to ask questions first and apologize if ever later. But she also knew how this played. Respect, compliance, composure. Still, something in her chest tightened as the officers approached. One to her window, the other lingering behind the rear of her car, angling to watch her blind spot. The one at her window, a white man with a square jaw and sun-worn skin, knocked twice on the glass with 2 fingers, not impatiently, but with the kind of confidence that implied he expected immediate obedience. She lowered the window halfway, her face expressionless, her tone measured. "Good morning, officer. Is there a reason I was stopped?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly as he examined her face, then dropped his gaze to her hands, still resting calmly on the wheel. "License and registration," he said. His voice was dry, edged with a casual hostility wrapped in fake politeness. "Routine patrol. You were drifting a little bit." "I wasn't aware of any drifting," she replied. "But I'll get you what you need." She moved slowly, deliberately, opening her glove box with her right hand and retrieving the neatly folded registration papers, then reaching for her wallet. Her movements were smooth, intentional, respectful, but also unmistakably familiar, like choreography memorized from years of knowing that being careful could be the difference between going home and not. As she handed him her license and registration, the second officer, a younger man with a broad chest and a mean edge in his posture, stepped closer to the rear of the vehicle, arms crossed, eyes scanning the interior. The older officer studied her license, his brow tightening as he read the information. "Dress," he muttered more to himself than to her. "You visiting family?" She replied, still calm. He lingered with her ID a moment longer than necessary, then straightened and motioned subtly to his partner. "Pop the trunk," he said. Alana didn't move. "Is that a request, or are you giving a lawful order?" she asked, her voice still steady, though firmer now. The second officer shifted again, one hand resting near the baton on his belt, the other inching just slightly closer to the holster on his hip. "You got something in there we need to be worried about?" he asked, his voice laced with mock suspicion. "I know what's in my trunk," she said. "And I'd like to understand the basis for searching it." "Ma'am, we don't need to argue," the first one said, still holding her ID. "You can either comply now or we do it the hard way." A long moment passed. Alana pressed the button beneath the dash. The trunk released with a soft click, rising slowly. The younger officer walked back toward it, disappearing from her view. She remained still, staring straight ahead as the older officer lingered by her window, expression unreadable. Silence stretched out around them. Then the younger officer returned, holding a small, clear plastic bag pinched between two fingers. It was filled with a pale powdery substance. "Well, now," he said, lifting it where she could see. "Guess you forgot to pack this properly." Alana didn't blink. "That wasn't in my trunk." "You sure about that?" "I'm sure." The older officer leaned closer, his breath stale and voice low. "Lady, you're not in DC anymore. You keep playing smart, we'll make this real uncomfortable." Alana turned her head slowly toward him, her eyes calm but sharp with intent, her voice unwavering. "I know my rights, and I'm invoking them now. I do not consent to this search, and I want legal representation. You've just presented an item that wasn't in my vehicle moments ago, and this is now a formal accusation." The older officer raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching into something between amusement and condescension. "Now she wants a lawyer," he said, glancing back at his partner. "You hear that, Trent? Got ourselves a law professor." Trent let out a short, joyless laugh, the kind that didn't mask the tension already creeping into the situation. "Or maybe she's just nervous. Guilty folks talk a lot." "I'm not guilty," Alana replied, her voice level, her gaze unflinching as she looked between them. "And if either of you had confidence in this arrest, you wouldn't need to mock me to cover your misconduct. You know this is unlawful, and so do I." The older officer stepped forward, closing the distance between them as he leaned down just enough to make his presence feel heavy. "That tone of yours," he muttered, his jaw tightening as he looked her up and down. "You keep it up and we'll add obstruction to your file. You think you're somebody special, but out here people learn real quick that a badge means you follow directions." Alana didn't move, didn't blink, didn't allow so much as a breath to betray the fire rising in her chest. She kept her hands steady, still resting on the steering wheel in plain view. "Then follow the law and call for a supervisor. Any further interaction without one is a direct violation of your department's own policy." The moment hung between them, brittle and hot, before the older officer finally stepped back, his face hardening with a kind of resolve that didn't look like justice. It looked like resentment. "Step out of the car," he said again, this time lower, tighter, the pretense of courtesy gone. "No," she answered, her voice still composed, but firmer now. "Not without a supervisor on scene. You have no right to search me, no cause to arrest me, and you're holding a bag of powder you didn't find in my car." That was when the performance ended. The older officer reached inside, unlocked the door from the inside panel, and yanked it open, grabbing her arm with the kind of force that made his intentions clear. Trent moved in at once, reaching across her to undo the seatbelt and drag her out of the vehicle. Their grips coordinated like they'd done this before, because they had. They didn't read her rights. They didn't pause to explain the charges. They didn't slow down, muttered. Her knuckles throbbed, her ribs burned, but her eyes stayed sharp. They didn't expect us to come at them head on. They always ran. This time they stood their ground. Salgado frowned. Which means they knew something we didn't. Alana nodded slowly. We intercepted the play, but I don't think it was the final move. Her comms unit buzzed. Naomi's voice returned. Director, we've decrypted the manifest in the lead truck. There's a secondary meeting point listed. Different from Lisbon. Domestic Houston, marked for 48 hours from now, and it's got Velt's signature on it. Alana's breath caught. He's still in country. Naomi hesitated. Or he wanted us to think he left. And now he wants us to come. Alana looked across the desert at the blinking lights of their victory. She didn't smile because she knew this wasn't the end. It was the invitation. The digital forensics lab inside the secured federal annex ran on red lighting in silent urgency. The air was cold. The hum of server racks steady and low. The USB retrieved from the mobile command crate had taken hours to bypass. Its encryption wasn't standard cartel nor even rogue government. It was custom-built by someone who understood the deep spine of DEA architecture. Someone who knew where to bury information so deep the agency itself wouldn't know it existed. Karen stood at the console, eyes locked on the data feed crawling across the monitors. Her face was pale, drained, not from shock, but recognition. Naomi stood beside her, cross-referencing each file as it unlocked, while Salgado and Alana watched in silence. The files weren't just logs or chat threads. They were dossiers, detailed reports spanning more than a decade. Each folder labeled by badge number and last known department. Inside, arrest records, inventory transfers, evidence audits, memos sent and intercepted. Chain of custody documents coded in near-identical formatting across 6 different precincts. Dozens of officers scattered across the country, most of them still active. Alana stepped forward, arms folded as she leaned over Karen's shoulder. How many names? Karen didn't look away from the screen. 73 so far. Naomi exhaled through her nose slowly. These aren't just crooked cops. They're co-conspirators. Every one of them helped move, cover, or reclassify cartel product. Some even ran side routes while still filing clean reports. And every one of them, Salgado added, was positioned on or adjacent to a federal task force, which means they had clearance. Karen clicked into a deeper folder. And that's not the worst of it. The room went still. She opened a new file. Project Holdback, a sealed archive hidden behind 3 layers of administrative clearance and a ghost identity authorizing its reactivation. Alana's voice was low. That's one of ours. Naomi frowned. Holdback. That's pre-2004, a failed asset rerouting protocol, right? Karen didn't answer. Instead, she opened the file. The contents filled the screen in slowly unrolling pages, program descriptions, funding charts, internal memos between senior DEA officials, and tactical guidelines for field officers. The original intention was clear. Operation Holdback had been conceived as a deep interdiction protocol, stage-controlled leaks of seized narcotics back into cartel circulation, tag them and trace distribution channels to build intelligence webs from the inside. High risk, high reward, and heavily classified. It was supposed to have been shut down after it backfired during a Florida trial when one of the tagged bricks re-entered the U.S. and killed 3 civilians in a crossfire. Publicly, the project was dismantled. Privately, the framework was mothballed, but the log said otherwise. Funding was quietly reauthorized 5 years ago, Karen said, through an anti-crime provision buried in the national enforcement budget. It was funneled through discretionary lines, signed off at the executive level by the prior DEA director, your predecessor. Alana's mouth drew into a hard line. He was compromised. No, Naomi said, flipping through the expenditure pages. He thought he was reviving the original version. Controlled product, controlled leaks. He had no idea it had already been hijacked. Salgado cursed under his breath. So, they used federal money, rebuilt the system. But this time, the product wasn't traced. It was laundered. The intelligence-gathering pretext was just a front. They turned the program inside out. Karen said instead of hunting the cartel, they became the cartel's most useful tool. And they covered every move under the same clearance the DEA uses to protect counter-terror cases. No one questioned it because no one wanted to dig into classified corridors. Alana looked at the blinking name at the top of the screen. Marcus Velt, listed as the original systems architect, then again 2 years later as a reassigned systems auditor logged under the alias Michael Varus, a name never officially filed, but present in every operation where Xeno had been used to erase or route data. He's not just part of the network, Alana said. He built the engine. Naomi's voice was tight. And now he's waiting in Houston. You realize what that means? Alana nodded. He wants to be caught. Salgado raised an eyebrow. Why? Alana stared at the screen at the wreckage of their system laid out in lines of digital confession. Because he doesn't think we'll do it. Because he thinks we'll hesitate. Because to bring him in, we'll have to expose all of this to the world. And we'll have to admit that the house wasn't just dirty. It was on fire and no one noticed. Karen looked at her then. What if he's right? Alana didn't blink. Then we burn it down ourselves and build it right. She turned to Naomi and Salgado. Assemble the strike team. Quiet. Full tactical prep. I want boots on the ground within 8 hours and blackout protocols in place. No leaks. We find that meeting point. We intercept. No more signals. No more ghosts. We bring Velton alive. Naomi gave a short nod. And if he fights? Alana's voice was ice. Then we finish what he started. 3 weeks after the compound raid in Houston, Alana Brooks stood beneath the vaulted rotunda of the Capitol, her right hand raised before a wall of cameras, surrounded by silence. Not the kind born from hesitation, but reverence. Every seat in the Congressional Oversight Chamber was filled. Behind her, the Justice Department's seal loomed, flanked by flags. Before her sat 13 members of Congress, bipartisan in name, but united in shock. The transcripts had circulated. The files had been decrypted and the truth had finally surfaced. She lowered her hand, took her seat at the center of the witness table, and adjusted the microphone. My name is Alana Brooks, and I serve as Director of the Drug Enforcement Administration, she began, her voice steady, controlled. I come before this committee not just as a federal officer, but as the woman falsely arrested by 2 of our own. That arrest exposed more than misconduct. It exposed a network, one rooted not in ideology, but in quiet opportunism. This was not a rogue faction. This was the natural evolution of a failed policy that we let rot under red tape and silence. She opened the folder before her, thick with names, programs, and budgets misused. She spoke for nearly 2 hours detailing Operation Holdback's original intent, the hijacking of its infrastructure and how federal resources were turned into currency for traffickers hiding inside their uniforms. She outlined how Velt, the ghost inside the system, had revived Xeno from the inside and used it to bypass oversight for years. But when she reached the end, she set aside the folder. This wasn't just a structural failure. It was a moral one. Because for every file there's a name. For every redacted line there was a victim. And for every silence we now have the responsibility to speak. The chamber was still when she finished. Then came the first round of applause. Then the second. It wasn't political. It was human. Mass arrests followed within the week. Federal marshals, internal affairs, and DOJ auditors swept through precincts across 6 states, executing sealed indictments that had been drafted the moment the files were authenticated. Some officers fled, others surrendered without a word. In Baton Rouge, a local commander was found attempting to torch a locker room file cabinet before backup arrived. In Phoenix, 2 supervisors were arrested during roll call. The sweep moved without announcement or fanfare, just precision. The DEA, backed by congressional emergency authorization, seized control of 6 precincts previously flagged for internal corruption. Commanders were replaced, databases frozen. Every officer recertified through background checks and psychological evaluations. More than 70 names on the USB were confirmed as active participants. 34 were indicted on federal conspiracy charges. 21 accepted plea deals in exchange for exposing the financial routes and laundering channels. 12 resigned before charges were filed. 6 committed suicide. Marcus Velt was one of the few to go quietly. He was arrested inside the basement of a private storage compound near Houston, a location buried beneath layers of shell companies and false rental names. The space was more than just a hideout. It was a digital command nest surrounded by humming server towers, military-grade communications equipment arranged with obsessive precision, and 3 meticulously kept passports laid out on the desk before him, each bearing a different name and nationality. American, Panamanian, Serbian, all authentic, all used. He didn't reach for the compact firearm taped beneath the desk, didn't twitch toward the biometric deadbolt on the wall behind him, and didn't even flinch as the tactical team advanced through the narrow corridor with weapons drawn and orders clear. He simply remained seated, watching the arrival like it was a scheduled appointment, not the end of a criminal empire. His face was still, almost calm, the expression of a man who had planned for this moment, and considered it inevitable. When Alana entered the room, stepping through the final door with her team flanking either side, he looked up from the folder in front of him and offered her a faint knowing smile. One that landed without warmth but carried weight, like punctuation on a story he believed he had written. "You finally made it," he said, his voice dry from hours of silence, but deliberate and precise. "Took you long enough?" She didn't return the smile. She stared at him for a long moment, not moving, not answering. Her eyes stayed on his, holding the weight of everything he had built and broken. Then at last she spoke, her voice calm but edged with steel. "You built a machine that devoured people," she said, her words landing evenly. "And you did it from inside an oath." Velt tilted his head slightly, his smile tightening at the corners. There was no denial, no deflection, only a quiet, deeply cynical certainty in his response. "No, I built a mirror and I just kept it clean." Alana didn't offer a rebuttal. She didn't need to. Instead, she stepped forward, crossed the final few feet to his desk, and reached down to pick up the ring of keys lying beside the passports. Keys that unlocked his compound, his digital vaults, and his history. Without a word, she turned and handed the keys to the agents at her back. Her voice low but absolutely firm. "Put him in black transport. No processing delay. I want him in federal isolation within the hour." The 2 agents moved in without hesitation. One secured his wrists with reinforced cuffs. The others searched him for hidden transmitters. Velt rose slowly to his feet, hands extended, movements deliberate and unhurried. Though he was now restrained and surrounded, he carried himself with the same calculated calm that had made him invisible for nearly a decade. As they began to lead him toward the exit, he turned his head slightly, casting one final glance toward Alana. His expression hadn't changed, still composed, still smug, still convinced that the system would bend itself back to its shape without him. "The system will survive this director," he said, his voice quieter now, but still etched with that same unnerving certainty. Alana met his gaze, her voice steady and clear. "That's the point. Not the version you built, the one we fix." He didn't reply. And this time, when the door closed behind him, it sounded nothing like retreat. It sounded like closure. The corridor beyond the holding cell was quiet, lined with muted lights that cast long reflections across the polished floor. Alana walked its length without hesitation, her footfalls absorbed by the stillness of the space, her expression calm, but unreadable. There was no applause waiting outside. No team gathered to greet her with congratulatory nods or rehearsed praise. What followed Velt's arrest was not celebration. It was reconstruction. In the days that followed, her agency moved with uncommon speed. A task force made up of internal auditors, independent watchdogs, and federal IT specialists was deployed to dismantle every remaining shadow of Xeno's architecture. The system's hidden root protocols were not simply disabled. They were extracted, decrypted, documented, and incinerated under direct oversight. What was once buried under anonymity in old clearance codes now became the foundation of transparency reform. But Alana knew that removing the cancer wasn't enough. Something had to grow in its place. Lamar was born not from policy, but necessity. A monitoring system with no central override, no manual entry loophole, and no access point controlled by a single badge or title. Designed collaboratively by whistleblowers, compliance experts, and forensic analysts. It was built to make sure no arrest, no evidence entry, no transfer, no disappearance would go unrecorded or unchallenged again. It was a system that demanded accountability at every layer. And for the first time in decades, that demand didn't just echo upward. It pressed inward. The name wasn't chosen in a boardroom. It was chosen by Alana alone. And when she sent the naming request through formal channels, she included a note. His name mattered. Let it be the one thing they never lose again. The system launched with full federal integration. 2 months later, Naomi Kersey stood at the head of the new Office of Internal Shielding, appointed without opposition. The office's mandate stretched beyond review and discipline.